All right, so this video is on deriving the quadratic formula, not on using the quadratic formula. So it does not teach you how to use it. If you want an example on that, you're going to have to look elsewhere. For the quadratic formula, deriving it, number one, what is the quadratic formula? The quadratic formula is a formula for solving for x in any quadratic equation, okay? So if you have, it will always work if you have a quadratic equation in standard form. So that would be like exactly like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. The formula will always get you an answer, even if the answer is irrational, even if it's an imaginary number. The quadratic formula will solve for x. The actual formula itself is x equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. All right, so being able to use that again is going to be in a different lesson. So where does that formula come from? Where does that big long formula come from? And the answer is, it's actually completing the square. This formula is completing the square. But somebody actually said, well, if we complete the square and we don't know the numbers, is there a way that I can just kind of plug a formula into a computer and tell it how to do completing the square? And it turns out the answer is yes. There's a way to just tell the computer, complete the square for me and get the answer for x for me. And this formula is it, okay? So it comes from completing the square, and I'm going to show you how to derive it. It's a completing the square method that you would use, you would tell the computer to do it in this particular way, okay? So we're going to do 2 examples before we derive the actual thing, because these 2 examples are going to help you understand the actual 3rd example, which will be the actual quadratic formula derivation. So this one is a simpler version where you're solving for x using complete the square, and I don't know what c is, but I do know what a is. All right, so what is the value of a, what is the value of b, and what is the value of c in this case? Well, a is 1, and b is 1. And c is the only number I don't know, so I'm just going to call it c. So if I don't know what c is, but I know that a is 1 and b is 1, can I solve using the quadratic, using complete the square? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and use complete the square. So the first method in complete the square is you have to have the constant on the right-hand side and the x squared and x term on the left. So I'm going to subtract c from both sides. So that's step 1. Step 2 is, if there is a coefficient of x squared, we have to divide everything by it. But the coefficient of x squared here is a equals 1. That's the number of the x squared right there. So if you divide everything by 1, nothing's going to happen. So there's nothing to do. Not applicable. Don't have to do it. Okay. Step 3 of completing the square is that you need to actually complete the square. So I need to find out what do I add to both sides so that the left-hand side is a perfect square set of factors. And then whatever that number is, to keep the equation balanced, I have to add it to both sides. So remember that the trick to finding whatever would complete the square is you take the middle term coefficient, so meaning the x term, whatever the x term is, the coefficient of that is 1. So take that 1, whatever b equals, take half of it. So half of b in this case is 1/2. And then after you take half of it, you're going to square whatever that answer is. I'm going to take that 1/2 and square it. I'm going to get 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 1/4. And that's the number I'm going to add to both sides in that blank space. So it'll become x squared plus x plus 1/4 equals negative c plus 1/4. All right, step 4 is to factor. the left-hand side. So that's this side right here. So see if you can factor that. You can always pause the video. Why is that looking so messy? Let me see. This should be a plus sign, I think. Plus 1/4. I don't know why I noticed that. All right. So step 4 is going to be factor that. So I'm looking for what two things will multiply to 1/4 and add to 1. Okay. Now, some of you will intuitively know how to figure that out because it's always, what times what equals 1/4, and it has to be the same two numbers. But if you can't intuitively figure it out yet, it just means you need a little more time. So the formula is going to be whatever, when you took b equals 1 and you took half of it, this number before you square it is always going to be the number you end up adding. So the number that you took half, where you took half of b, before you square it, that's always going to be the number you end up putting in here. And if you see, if I check, 1/2 times 1/2 equals 1/4, and 1/2 plus 1/2 equals that invisible 1 over there. So we lower it down. And in step 4, you want to rewrite it so that the parentheses, which are always the same on both sides, is written as 1 parentheses squared. And then the other side is still negative c plus 1. Step 5 is to square root both sides. And remember that there's always a positive and a negative square root to every number, except 0. So x plus 1/2, the square root and the square cancel each other out, and that's going to equal plus or minus the square root of negative c plus 1/4. Now I'm going to rewrite this a little bit because I need negative c plus 1/4 to be one number. Right now it's two terms. I need it to look like 1. So I'm going to write this as negative c over 1 plus 1/4. And then I'm going to get a common denominator. So I'm just simplifying it so that I'm taking the square root of one number instead of the square root of two numbers, okay? So I'm going to find the LCD, which is 4. And I'm going to write that in a different color just to kind of highlight it. I'm going to multiply this fraction by 4 over 4. And so that's going to be negative 4c over 4 plus 1/4. And then that's going to end up being plus or minus negative 4c plus 1 over 4. And I'm going to just move this over. LCD is 4. And I'm going to simplify this way up here. That's going to be the same thing as plus or minus square root of 1 minus 4c. I'm just flipping the order of the 1 and negative 4c. So 1 minus 4c all over the square root of 4. And I just pushed the plus minus sign to the top. Square root of 4 you can simplify. See if you can figure out what that is. If you got 2, that's good. And then I'm going to copy down the x plus 1/2 on the other side of that equation. Step 6 is to solve for x by adding or subtracting whatever's with the x. So I'm going to get rid of that 1/2. Hopefully you remember to get rid of plus 1/2. We're going to subtract 1/2 from both sides. So x is going to equal negative 1/2 plus or minus square root of 1 minus 4c all over 2. I'm going to just write that as one fraction. You've really done all the work here, okay? I'm just writing it. They both have a common denominator of 2, so I'm just rewriting it with the 2 on the bottom. And negative 1 plus or minus square root of 1 minus 4c. So if I know for sure that I have an equation where a equals 1 and b equals 1, and I don't know what c is, the answer is going to, as soon as I find c, I can just plug this into a calculator and it will find out the answer. But if I don't know what c is, I can't do that, right away. But I can say, okay, as soon as somebody gives me the information of what c is, I can just plug it into a calculator and get an answer. And if there's 10 different c's, I can solve 10 different answers really fast if I can get a calculator to do it for me. All right. So So this is, we just solved for what x is. Anytime you have y equals x squared plus x plus c, excuse me, not y equals. Anytime you have x squared plus x plus c equals 0. So I've got a 1x squared plus 1x, and then the only number I don't know is c. Well, what happens if I don't know, let's say, b and c? There are two numbers I don't know. We're going to do the same thing, and you might want to take a break here, because if you understand this much, you're doing great. And we're just going to increase the number of things we don't know. Let's say that we're solving for an equation, and I don't know b and I don't know c. Okay. So we're solving for x using complete the square, but this time I don't know b and I don't know c. I do, however, still know that a equals 1. So I know here, this is a situation where I know that a is 1, but I still don't know b and I still don't know c. Can I get a formula to solve for the answer for x so that once I do figure out b and c, I can just plug it in really quickly? And the answer is yes. And so we're going to go ahead and do that using completing the square. Same method as we just did. Okay? So what was step 1? See if you can remember that and do that. Step 1 was to move the constant. So remember that c stands for a number. Once I figure it out, it's just going to be a number that I don't know yet, but it is just a number. Whatever that number is, you move it to the right-hand side. Then what was step 2? Hopefully you remember that step 2 is you divide by a. And a is the number in front of x squared. So that's a equals 1. If I divide everything by 1, nothing happens. So there's no need to do step 2. What was step 3? This you do have to remember. This is where you actually want to complete the square on the left-hand side. So I'm looking for something that if I add, this will factor out really nicely on the left-hand side. So we're looking for that perfect number that if I add it on the left, it will make it a nice, perfect factor on the left. And whatever that number is that I add, I have to add it on the other side as well. Same thing to keep the equation balanced. So remember the formula for what that was is, in this case, we're not going to get this intuitively, so you're going to want to use the formula. You take whatever the coefficient of x is. Remember, the coefficient of x, we don't know it, but it's going to be some number b. We don't know it yet, but that is a number. So we're going to take that b, and we're going to take half of it. So half of b, whatever b is, we're going to do half times b, which is just the same thing as b over 2. Then we're going to take whatever that number was, and we're going to square it. So when I square a fraction, I square the top and the bottom, so that's going to be b squared over 4. So I'm going to add b squared over 4 on the left and b squared over 4 on the right. Step 4 is to factor this. Now this is going to be a doozy. Factoring this is no easy thing unless you remember the rules. So this is not an intuitive thing, this is a rule thing. When I factor it, what number always ends up being over here? Oh, you might have some intuitions about it. All right, in case you need some help, your intuition needs a little bit of a booster. Remember, it's whatever, when I took b and I took half of it, it's whatever that number was. So I took half of it and it was b over 2. So that's always going to be the number that I add to both sides here. And if I double check, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to b squared over 4. So b over 2 times b over 2 is b squared over 4. And it has to add to b. So b over 2 plus b over 2 is 1b over 2 plus 1b over 2 is the same thing. So that's 2b over 2, which equals 1b. So that is correct. B over 2 is correct. Clean that up there a little bit. Okay. Then we want to write this so that it's a perfect square. So it's going to be x plus b over 2 squared equals negative c plus b squared over 4. Step 5 is I'm going to square root both sides of that equation. So I'm just copying it over again, just to make it clear what's going on. And square rooting both sides. Anytime you square root, you have to have a positive and a negative answer. Cancel out the square root and the square, get x plus b over 2. The other side is going to be plus or minus square root of negative c plus b squared over 4. Again, anytime you're taking a square root, you don't want there to be two different terms. If possible, you want to combine that into one. So I'm just going to write this as negative c over 1 and get a common denominator. Since my LCD of both of this is what? Hopefully you know it's 4. And I'll multiply this by 4 for 4. So that's going to become negative 4c plus b squared over 4. Under that square root sign. I'm just going to reverse the order of this so that the b squared is in the front. Okay. And the square root is separated on the top and the bottom. And I'm going to do that because if I do that, then I can take the square root of 4. What is the square root of 4? So I can replace that with a 2. If you got that, that's great. This should start to look a little tiny bit familiar if you've seen the quadratic formula before. All right, step 6 is going to be to solve for x by subtracting b over 2. So see if you can write down what that answer is going to be. So if I put a negative b over 2 in the front here, plus or minus b squared minus 4ac over 2. I can just combine this fraction and this fraction to be the, because it has the same denominator. So x equals negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4c over 2. So again, if I have an equation, the original equation looked like x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So if I have a quadratic equation where I know that a equals 1, but I don't know b, and I don't know c, and I still have to turn something in, or I have to do it really fast. I know that I'm gonna have to do this really fast, and I'm allowed to punch it into a calculator. I would just say, okay, they're gonna tell me what b and c equals, and when I do that, if I can just use this formula, I'll get the answer, because they're guaranteeing me that a equals 1, and I just don't know b and c. So it's this formula would get me the answer. Only if I know that a equals 1, if a equals 1. But of course, sometimes a doesn't equal 1. So again, I advise you to kind of take a break and massage your head, because we are now going to do the full-on, how do you solve no matter what a, b, and c equal, even if you don't know any of them, right? So example 3. We are now going to derive the quadratic formula. And we're going to do that by solving for x using complete the square. For ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And remember that all quadratic equations can be made to look like this. So that means that the quadratic formula can solve any quadratic equation. All right? Even if we don't know what a, b, and c are yet, we can make a formula that can get me an answer for x, and then we can give the formula to a computer, and the computer can do it for us a whole bunch of times. Okay? A lot of times you have to use the quadratic formula a lot of times, so you don't want to solve for x 100 times when you're already very good at it. It's not really fun work, and there's no point to it. So the quadratic formula allows you to tell a computer to do the work for you. All right, so let's get at it. We're going to do the 6 steps of completing the square. I hope you took a break And you might want to try these 6 steps on your own and pause the video at this point and do as much as you can before you restart it and then, get some help. Step 1 was what again? Hopefully you remember it's to get the ax squared plus bx term on one side and move the c term to the other side. So you're going to subtract c from both sides. Step 2 was what? Remember that it was to divide by a. So here I don't know what a is, and there is a letter a, so we're assuming there is a letter a, and you have to divide it out. You're not allowed to have a leading term. That's not 1x squared. So you're going to divide. I'm just rewriting the equation to make that explicit, and we're going to divide every term by a. So this a and this a cancels out. We get a squared. This does not cancel out because I don't know what b and a are, so it's going to be bx over a. In fact, let's even write it as b over a times x, which is the same thing, equals negative c over a. And the reason why I'm writing b over a separately is because remember b over a is a number, I just don't know what it is. Because it's really something x squared plus a number in front of the x, and I just don't know what that number is, and it's, whatever b or a are, if I divide them, I'll get that number. Step 3, see if you can remember what it was and kind of start it, even if you get stuck. As much as you can remember. So hopefully you at least remember that the point of step 3 is you have to add something to the left-hand side to make this factorable. I know it looks messy, but you want to make it factorable to a perfect factor. And whatever that number is, you have to add to both sides. And the question is, how on earth do I figure out what number do I add on both sides? So if you got that far and you know that you have to add something, you're doing okay. You're hanging in there. You know what's going on and you just need to clean things up. So remember that to get this blank, you take the coefficient of x, so that's b over a, and you take half of it. So step 1, take half, 1/2 times b over a. See if you can figure out what that equals. That it goes 1 times b is b, and on the bottom 2 times a is 2a. And then whatever that is, you're going to square it. So you're going to square the numerator, b squared, and you're going to square the number and the variable in the denominator. So 2 squared is 4, a squared. This is the number you're going to add to both sides of the equation, okay? Again. So we're going to add b squared over 4a squared. B squared over 4a squared. Step 4 is to factor. Factor this right here. So when I factor that, it's going to be x and x. And I'm looking for 2 things here that are going to be multiplying to b squared over 4a squared and add to b over 2a. So I'm looking for 2 things that will multiply to b squared over 4a squared. And if it's not coming to you intuitively, remember there was a formula? Where in the formula does that come at? Some of you might intuitively know if there's a b squared, it's going to be b. And if there are 4 squared, it's going to be a 2a. If you don't, remember it's whatever you took from step 3 when you halved it. Whatever you halved before you squared it, what did you get? And it's this. That's the number you're going to put into this space. So again, what are we going to put in this space? The number that we halved before we squared it. So if you put b over 2a, you're following, keep staying in there. We're going to rewrite this as something squared. So it's x plus b over 2a squared. And the other side was this stuff right here. Oh, yeah, this stuff right here. So I'm just copying that down here. Is that up there? The B squared. See if you can start step 5 on your own. Just going to copy the problem again. Why do you do that? All right. So with this step, you're supposed to square root both sides. Remember that everything has a positive and a negative square root. This is going to cancel with that. You're going to be left with x plus b over 2a. On the right-hand side, I don't want two things in that square root. I want it to be one fraction, not two. So I'm going to need to get a common denominator. So my LCD is going to be 4a squared. So I'm going to have to multiply this first fraction by 4a over 4a. That's going to become negative 4ac. See if you can finish that off and make it into one fraction. (4a times a is 4a squared plus b squared over 4a squared). Remember that's still under square root sign. I'm just not going to write it yet. So they're both the same denominator. So now you can combine that into one fraction. What is that one fraction going to be? That's going to be 4 squared on the bottom, negative 4ac plus b squared on the top. Then I'm just going to switch the order of this so b squared's in the front. You write that. And then remember that this is all under square root from before. And then you had an x plus b over 2a on the other side. I'm just bringing it down from here. I'm going to separate this into two square roots, and you'll see why in a second. So this is going to be plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over the square root of 4a squared. The top part I can't simplify. I cannot square root b squared, guys, because it's not b squared, it's b squared minus 4ac. There's two terms there. If there's two terms, I cannot square root a term separately. This, however, is only one term. So I can square root the 4. Square root of 4 is 2, square root of b squared is a. So this denominator is 2a. In fact, let me write that over here on the side. So that means that this is plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And that equals this x plus b over 2a, which is awfully convenient. In a second, we're going to do step 6 and see if you can finish this off on your own. So to solve for it, I'm going to put a negative b over 2a in the front here. Cancel that out. X equals negative b over 2a plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And then I'm just going to combine it into one fraction, see if you can do that. You have just worked together with me, derive the quadratic formula. So no matter what my quadratic equation is, I can always use this formula to solve if I know what a means here in standard form.